Chapter 9. Philip Talassos, head of the Imperial Ministry for the Orient, summoned the monsieur a second time to massage his hands and feet. It was still early in the autumn, the sun had only just set, and nobody felt cold except himself, but the minister could not get warm. The little vulture-nosed man lay on a couch, tightly packed in blankets and cushions. In front of him a charcoal burner warmed his hands, and there was another for his feet. Standing at the other side of the couch, the monsieur, a slave, apprehensively and diligently rubbed the old man's wrinkled skin, from which the veins stood out, blue and shriveled. The minister puffed and threatened. The monsieur did his best to avoid the scars on the old man's shoulders. These scars, he knew, dated from the time when the minister, then a slave in Smyrna, had been whipped by his masters. The doctors had tried 1,000 remedies for removing those scars. They had operated, the great specialist Scribon Largus had tried all his salves, but the ancient scars would not vanish. It had been a bad day, a black day. The whole staff in the minister's house had already been made to feel that. The secretary knew what was to blame for his master's morose temper. It had descended upon him when he received a letter from the Ministry of Appeal, a short, informal query. The people in that ministry, above all the stout and sly Junius Thrax, would gladly have done without consulting the minister, for whom they had no love. But under the present emperor, the Ministry for the Orient had become the center of the imperial policy, and they knew what a fuss Philip Talassos was accustomed to make if his opinion was not requested on any subject even remotely related to his sphere. And so the Ministry of Appeal had postponed finally deciding a certain question sent to them by the empress until they should first get his opinion. In itself it concerned a matter of no great importance. It concerned a few old Jews who had been condemned to forced labor several years before in connection with the disturbances in Caesarea. The empress had evidently taken a whim onto her head again, for the 100th time. She wanted to have the offenders amnestied. Her Majesty had a suspicious weakness for the Jewish rabble. Horror, trollop, the minister thought, giving the monsieur an angry push with his elbow. Probably she herself had a strain of the Jew in her, in spite of her old and noble name. From time immemorial, those insolent Roman aristocrats had been infected with corruption to the very marrow. Nevertheless, there was not much that one could bring up against this whim of the empress. Only very general objections. The position in the Orient demanded the greatest severity, even in apparently trifling matters, and so forth. The little vulture-nosed man felt exasperated. He sent the monsieur away. The idiot wasn't of the slightest use to him. He turned on his side, drew his sharp knees up to his chin, and thought the whole matter over. These confounded Jews, they were always queering one's pitch. Since the successes of Corbulo on the Parthian frontier, Rome's oriental policy had been gratifyingly energetic. The emperor dreamt of becoming a new Alexander and of extending the empire's sphere of influence to the very Indus. A great and mysterious campaign to reach the distant East, of which Rome had dreamt for a century, and which for a generation had dwindled into an empty fancy, was being seriously discussed now in the stadium. The official heads of the army had worked out plans. The finance ministry had, after careful consideration, decided that the money for the campaign could be assured. There was only one weak point in this daring plan for a new Alexandrian campaign, the province of Judea. It cut across the marching route, and one could not begin the great work until this doubtful point was made safe and sure. The other gentlemen in the imperial cabinet had smiled when the minister Talassos drew their attention to this. They thought that his hatred of the Jews had become a fixed idea. But he, Philip Talassos, had known the Jews since the days of his Asiatic youth. He knew that one could not live at peace with them, that they were fanatical, superstitious, insanely arrogant people, and that they would never leave one in peace until they were taught a final lesson, until their insolent capital was razed to the ground. Again and again the Roman governors had been taken in by their ingratiating promises, but again and again their assurances were discovered to be lies. Never had this absurd little province become a loyal part of the empire, as so many other greater and more powerful provinces had done. Their god refused to have anything to do with other gods. In reality, there had been a state of war in Judea ever since the death of the last king who had resided in Jerusalem, and Judea would remain unsettled, there would be war in it, the projected campaign would remain impossible, until Jerusalem was laid in ruins. The minister knew that he was right, but he also knew that it was not entirely the Jews' fault, for as often as he heard their name, rage overmastered him. He thought of the past. He had been presented along with an expensive candelabra to a cultivated Greek. While in his master's service, he had set himself obstinately to rise by the means of his intelligence and his talent for languages, so that at last his master had agreed to provide him with a good education. Finally, he had entered into competition with the candidates for posts in the imperial service. But when the secretary of Emperor Caius examined him, the Jewish interpreter Theodore Zacchaeus laughed at his Aramaic, so that the imperial board just failed him and no more. And it had been a trifling error, indeed it was questionable whether it had been an error at all, and the filthy Jew hadn't even questioned his rendering, he had merely bettered it. He himself had said Nablion, and the Jew had suggested Nabla, or alternatively Nebil, but in no circumstances Nablion, and while doing so the low hound had smiled contemptuously. And then, when after so many years of sweat and expense he had not been taken into the Roman government service after all, what had his master done to him? He had him whipped almost to death. When the minister remembered how the Jew had smiled, he became cold with fear and rage. Still, it really was not personal resentment alone. It was his keen political instinct that made him so bitter against the Jews. The world was Roman. The world was pacified through the harmonious Roman-Greek system. Only the Jews held out and refused to recognize the blessings of this all-powerful organization which bound the peoples together. The great trade routes to India, destined to carry Greek culture to the distant Orient, could not be rendered secure until this rebellious, stiff-necked people were humbled to the dust. At the court, unfortunately, they had no eye for this Judean peril. The atmosphere in the imperial palace was far too friendly to the Jews. His fat colleague, Junius Thrax, acted as a patron to them. They had crept into the finance ministry, too. In the last 3 years alone, 22 of them had been raised to the nobility. They were pushing their way into the dramatic world and into literature. One could feel almost physically that they were disintegrating the empire with their silly, superstitious books. That Claudius Reginus fellow was throwing the stuff in shiploads onto the market. When the old minister thought of Reginus, he drew his knees still higher. For the slyness of the man, repellent as he was, he had respect. And then Reginus had a pearl in his possession, a flawless, gigantic, tenderly glowing pearl. Talassos would have liked to buy the pearl from the man. He imagined that, if he wore it upon his finger, it would ease the dryness of his skin. Probably the pearl would have a good effect, too, on the scarred places on his shoulders. But the confounded Jew was rich, money did not tempt him, and he refused to part with the pearl. The minister Talassos thought of this and that, the disturbances in Caesarea, Reginus, and his ring. Should one summon the Senate? One could use the Parthian War as an excuse, and it was Napoleon after all. Suddenly he threw himself on his back, stretched himself, and stared with his dry reddened eyes at the ceiling. The pains in his stomach were gone, also the coldness of his feet. He had an idea, a splendid idea. No, he wouldn't wreak any petty revenge. What advantage would it be to him if these 3 dogs perished in the brickworks of Tibur? The Jews could get their darlings out if they wanted. They could pickle the 3 of them in garlic, or preserve them in their Sabbath cooking chests. He had something better up his sleeve. For the setting free of these 3 men, he would call the Jews to a reckoning such as no clerk in the finance ministry would ever be able to work out. The edict regarding Caesarea. He would couple the Caesarean affair with the amnesty of the 3 men. Tomorrow he would again lay the edict regarding Caesarea before the emperor. For 7 months he had been waiting for the signature. On this occasion he would secure it, for one couldn't concede everything to the Jews. One couldn't grant them their 3 criminals and the city of Caesarea as well. It was either the one or the other. Seeing that the empress desired it, her precious martyrs would be set free, but in return they must finally refuse the Jewish demands regarding Caesarea. He summoned a secretary and asked for his memorandum on Caesarea. As far as he could remember, it was short and to the point. That was how the emperor liked things, for he hated to plague his head with politics. His interests lay elsewhere. Besides, he was quick at grasping things. The emperor, he had a quick, keen mind. If one could only bring him to the point of carefully reading over the memorandum, one would soon have his signature for the edict as well. And this business of the 3 forced laborers simply could not be settled without finally deciding the whole Caesarean affair. Yes, this time the emperor must come to a decision. It was a fortunate inspiration of the empress to ask that these 3 men should be set free. The secretary brought the memorandum. Talassos glanced over it. Yes, he had put the affair very clearly and convincingly. Apart from slaves, the population of Caesarea was composed of Jews, Greeks, and Romans, in the proportion of 40% of the first to 60% of the latter too. But in the town council, the Jews held a majority. They were rich, and the election statutes based the franchise on economic principles. This franchise had remained intact in the provinces of Syria and Judea. Why should not those who supplied the greater part of the common revenue decide how that revenue should be spent? But in Caesarea, those election regulations imposed extraordinary hardships on the majority of the population, for the Jews exploited their power in the town council quite unscrupulously. Instead of using the public monies for the needs of the people, they sent great sums of it to Jerusalem for the temple and for religious purposes. So it was no wonder that there were bloody clashes again and again at the elections. The Greeks and Romans in Caesarea remembered with bitterness that they had been the original citizens when the city was founded in Herod's reign, and that they had built the harbor from whose revenue the city lived. Finally, the Roman governor resided in Caesarea, and that the Greeks and Romans should be oppressed by the Jews in the official capital of the province was doubly unendurable. Surely one had given sufficient consideration to the touchiness of the Jews in conceding absolute autonomy to them in Jerusalem. It was not expedient to grant any further indulgence to this people who were never satisfied. Caesarea's history, the ancestry and religion of the greater part of the population, their blood and their powers, were Gentile. The city of Caesarea, on which the peace and security of the whole province depended, would not countenance it should the most loyal part of its population be permanently refused the electoral rights they so undeniably deserved. In his adroit and skillful memorandum, the minister had not tried in the least to suppress the Jews' arguments. He had pointed out that in the event of an alteration in the franchise, the Greek and Roman population would have control over the whole Jewish contribution to the city revenues, which in practice would amount to a comprehensive expropriation of the Jewish capitalists. But he very skillfully showed that that was a trifling evil, compared with the monstrous injustice involved in the fact that the official capital of a province so important for the imperial policy in the east as Judea was actually controlled under the existing franchise by a small number of rich Jews. He read the memorandum over again and carefully considered it. His arguments were irrefutable. He smiled. His resolve was taken. Yes, he would renounce the smaller prize, the 3 prisoners, so as to wrest from the Jews the greater, the beautiful seaport of Caesarea. He summoned his servants and cursed them. He ordered the charcoal fires, the blankets, and cushions to be carried out. What were the dunces thinking of? Did they want him to die of heat? He walked up and down on his thin shanks. Life flowed back into his bony wrists. He sent an urgent demand to the emperor for an audience next morning. He saw his way now. His plan could not miscarry. For he was in no hurry. He could enjoy his revenge at his leisure. Several decades had passed since the Jewish interpreter had smiled at him. Napoleon. Yes, it was Napoleon now, and it would continue to be Napoleon. He could wait. Once the edict was signed depriving the Jews in Caesarea of their insolent power, there would be no need for the fact to be announced at once. The matter could rest for months or even a year, until the plans for the great Oriental campaign were ripe. Yes, he would lay his suggestions regarding Caesarea before the emperor tomorrow. He felt certain that in this form he would carry them through. He smiled. Before supper he dictated his reply to the query from the Ministry of Appeal regarding the amnesty of the 3 Jewish prisoners in the brickworks at Tibur. Junius Thrax would open his eyes when he learned that Talassos had nothing, absolutely nothing, against the proposal. At the supper table, the jeweler Claudius Reginus noted reflectively that the old morose minister was in strangely high spirits.